Hi, guys. I'm Karthik, and today I'm going to be talking about my framework for learning, specifically for SAT math. Now, if you see my last video, you know how important question review and having the ideal ratio is, right? Question review is the most important part of learning, right? In fact, it's like actually the only part of learning, right? When you take the SAT, every time you take a test or a practice test, you're just assessing where you are. And the review is the part where you actually learn from your previous mistakes. So if you have no review or you don't have proper review, you're basically gambling with your score. And the ideal ratio I described for reading questions specifically was about 50-50. But for math, I believe it's actually more important that you review, right? I think you have to put 66% of your effort towards review and then the other third towards actually taking tests and assessing yourself, right? And that's because fundamentally they're different questions for math and reading, right? Math questions are extremely conceptual. When you have a choice of four answer choices, even though they might seem similar, you do the problem and you get the right answer from your work, right? You isolate one answer as being correct. Whereas in reading, you have all the answer choices that could be potentially correct, and you use methods of finding out why one question is more or one answer is more incorrect than the other. And that's the reason why you pick the correct answer as reading. So reading is more rank order choice and math is more conceptual where there's one clear answer, right? So if you're focusing on concepts as your main focus for learning, the way you review your questions should be completely different than in the reading SAT. The questions that you even face are just so completely different. So my framework for reviewing math is actually completely different than reading. It first starts off with this idea of interpretation gaps versus concept gaps. So what are they and how do you even differentiate from them? So interpretation gaps. This is a gap where you literally don't understand the question, right? You've never seen that type of question. You've never seen that kind of math, or you literally don't understand the language, right? If you have an interpretation gap, you're often thinking to yourself, I don't even know where to begin with this question. So if you're thinking on that pattern, you probably have an interpretation gap, right? The next kind of mistake is the concept mistake, right? And don't get these two have a very slight difference, but it's very important, right? So if you don't understand the formula or the type of equation in the question, right, the literal math, then you have a concept gaps. And obviously there's some overlap between interpretation and concept, but the concept gaps is more math heavy and the interpretation gap is more about the literal question itself, right? So that's very slight difference, but it's very different on how you approach that kind of problem, right? So you don't understand, if you have a concept mistake, you don't understand literally how to solve the equation and you don't know even how to format it, right? So careless mistakes, right? I often hear this when I talk about these two kinds of math errors and why they're the only ones that are out there. So people often say like, oh, but what about careless mistakes where you just miss a negative sign or whatever? So my thought is that you shouldn't disregard them, right? You shouldn't just say, oh, that was a careless mistake and I won't do it next time, right? Careless mistakes are genuine mistakes. You have to actually focus and think about why you've made that mistake. All careless mistakes are actually concept gaps. And even though you might understand the math and how to do the math, the reason why they're concept gaps is because you haven't fully mastered the topic. That's why you've been able to allow yourself to make careless mistakes. Think about it. When was the last time you made a careless mistake adding 2 plus 2, adding 5 plus 5, right? Your ingrained knowledge of simple addition is so strong, it is impossible for you to make a careless mistake. So careless mistakes are really just concept gaps that haven't achieved full mastery. Now, how do we begin to understand interpretation gaps and how do we actually solve them, right? Firstly, you have to figure out what you do know, right? From the question, you'll see the phrasing and maybe you don't even understand where to begin, but look at the specific phrases that you do understand, the ones that you've seen before, and write out what it means. So write out the phrase and write out like a good sentence or so of what it means. And obviously you can do this in your head, but I think writing it down is just so much more powerful. So write down exactly what you do know from the things and assemble all of those, right? And then I do the opposite. Every single thing that you don't know, specifically write them and break them down into parts, right? I don't know what this specific word means in this context. I don't know what this means in this phrase. Write down every single one of them separately. Now, this is a difference from when you're learning from a practice test and versus like a real test. So if you're using accurate practice, like I've recommended before, practice tests are good accurate practice, the ones that come from College Board. But practice tests specifically will have like a thing at the back where you can see an explanation of every answer. And this is where you refer to that and you look for the detailed explanation, right? And you might think, oh, I'm just looking at the answer. Well, the work that you do beforehand of identifying what you do know and what you don't know is very important, as that allows you to specifically find your gap. And then you use the answer to find your gap, right? You use the solution, right? But if a real test, you don't have a solution, you have to use your online resources, because effectively all the gaps in math are something that you don't currently know. You can't just magically get that from somewhere. So you have to either refer to online resources. I really like Khan Academy because it's free. I can use it 24 hours as much as I want. But you can also refer to someone more experienced than you, right? So Khan Academy also partnered with College Board, and they have specific SAT practice with every single math concept that you're ever going to encounter. So I think it's an amazing resource, but utilize that to figure out exactly what you don't know. And then once you do figure out what those terms that you've highlighted that you didn't know previously meant, that's when you redo the problem. You redo the problem knowing the terms and solve it fully. Make sure you understand every single step and why you've done it, right? You can use online resources, or you can use a combination of your practice test and the online resource to figure out every step of the way, right? But the most important part of the interpretation gap is not that you now know how to solve the problem after referring to it once. It's the fact that you know that you have a gap there. You need to now practice that type of problem. You need to constantly refer to that like problem. You need to go on Khan Academy and do 5 of those a day and make sure you've completely mastered the skill of that specific type of math problem, right? Because if you encounter that again, you want to make sure that you fully understand it and know how to do it. So the other kind of mistake, the concept gap. And when you have a concept gap, you're normally going to think, I solved it wrong. I didn't do it correctly, right? And that's because you literally made a mistake within the math. You understood how to do it and you understood what formulas you needed to use, but you made a mistake with the math itself. So same thing like the other one, and you fully understand the question now. So there's no need to figure out what you don't know. The mistake was in the math itself. So you need to figure out where that mistake specifically lied in, right? And either you can refer to the answer, right, to figure out the answer. So you know that you made a mistake in this particular section. But this is where you do need to refer to experience or Khan Academy. See, Khan Academy, the way you would use it if you were using a real test is you'd find the concept, you learn the concept, and then come back to your question, right? But if you want to get the reason of why you made the mistake directly, the only way to really do that is to refer to experience. Of course, the Khan Academy one is longer, but if you can't refer to experience, that's really the only choice you got. And honestly, if you refer to Khan Academy, you'll get a better understanding of how to do the problem and you won't need anyone else to help you. So there are pros and cons to either referring to someone else or going on online resources, but both work at the end of the day. You need to understand what specific question you did incorrectly, what specific part of that question you did incorrectly. And then after that, you need to review all those types, right? Every single type of question that you got incorrectly, you need to understand that you don't know how to do that. Even though you might know the problem and you might think it's a careless mistake, if you made a careless mistake, if you made a mistake at all, that means that you have not reviewed it enough and you don't have full mastery over the concept, right? Going back to the 2+2 analogy, you don't make mistakes doing 2+2 because you have it mastered. So master the skill, right? That's the goal of finding out what type of gap it is essentially you figure out what you've done wrong and you know that you have to practice that skill now. But that's the most important part of finding out what kind of mistake you have and doing this review at all. The techniques that I've shown you to identify what problem you've done, that actually doesn't do anything. That just tells you what you need to work on, right? So focus on mastering that skill. You need to focus on doing so many problems like that, that if you ever encountered a problem that even had remotely this similar same type of language or concept, that you would instantly know how to do it. You'd instantly understand the concept in your head and be able to solve it extremely quickly. That's mastery, right? And even for questions that you get correct, right? If you guessed on the question, you got it right, or you use like process of elimination to find the right answer, that means you didn't know how to do the problem. You need to figure out again if you had a concept gap or if you had an interpretation gap, and then do this whole process for every question that you guessed or did process of elimination for. Right? On the real SAT, you can obviously guess if you don't know the answer, and you shouldn't leave anything completely blank. Right? And the rules might be a little bit different for the digital SAT because it's adaptive, but on paper SATs, you should guess. But when you're practicing, you can guess still, but leave a little mark on that question saying that you guessed so that you know that you didn't know how to solve that problem, right? If you don't do that and you don't master the skills that you know that you don't know, you're leaving points to chance. You're gambling with your SAT score. Is that something you really want to do? Do you want to gamble away like some of the points, just knowing that you may or may not get them? Like, oh, I'll just leave it to a 25% chance I get it correct. No, we're trying to maximize our score here. So at the end of the day, if you don't apply this method and you don't do the review and the hours of review that come after figuring out that you have an issue, that this video was useless. You basically wasted your time, right? So as an actionable step, I want you today or tomorrow to apply this method to a certain question to figure out what kind of gap you have, and then commit to practicing for at least 5 problems on that specific type of problem. So find the concept that it is, or figure out the interpretation that you didn't know, and either look up the interpretation and figure out what it means specifically and practice questions of that sort, or figure out the concept that you didn't know, go to Khan Academy, and then figure out the exact method and practice their problems and watch their videos on exactly how to do it, right? If you don't do that and you don't commit to doing that for at least 5 problems after the problem that you solved and got incorrect, then you've basically wasted your time. So commit to doing that. Also, I'm offering free SAT prep, and the spots are actually filling fast. I only have 3 left. And if you're interested, go to the link down in the description, fill it out, and I hope you guys learned something today.